So if I could just, some people might feel indifferently about this, and some people might think, yes, let's get rid of her. So could people who feel indifferent, could you just put about having to agree on the curriculum, could you put your hands up, please? And people who would like to see Greer go. Anybody would like to see Greer go? 1, 2. Okay, and quite a few of you didn't pop up your hands. Is that because you're abstaining? You're not sure? Okay, yeah, good point. Do you mind if we, yeah?
I think you could say, regardless of what she said, questionable as it is, she was an important figure in the movement and political party for that activity.
Okay. Okay, please.
And I think that the way she was covered was really good, because if you don't pull out things publicly, then it's not being taught in a way that defines why it's there. People might come across it and go along with it, and there's no people.
Okay, thank you. All good points. Okay, shall I let you sit on it then and get back to you if that's your view, Elena? Yeah, does anyone else share Elena's view? You share Elena's view? Okay. Mark finds her quite objectionable, and he has had encounters with terms on Twitter, and it hasn't been pleasant. So, yeah, I think that is a concern for him. But I appreciate your pie.
I was just thinking, if you end up taking her off the curriculum, then maybe put in someone else who writes about gender essentialism, because it is an important perspective to have and to be able to critique. And yeah.
Okay, no, good point. All right, I shall ponder on this and get back to people. Thank you so much, and thank you, Callum.
Right, kia ora everybody. My name's Callum McRae, and I'm here to talk to you about biomedical constructions and reconstructions of sex, which is basically how doctors and those in the medical field define sex, or don't define sex, as we will learn about, and how these things can be redefined and or remade. And just because we've had a little bit of a discussion about, should we be talking about TERFs and things, I'm not a TERF, just so you're aware. I mean, do I look like a cis-het person? Okay, so who am I? So my area of expertise is biomedical science, and I've worked as a consultant for the School of Biological Science in trying to make courses such as BMSc 116, which is Sex and Evolution, trying to make that as gender neutral as possible, which is a challenge because a lot of the language used is based very much in the idea of gender and sex being interconnected. And I've also done quite a bit of science outreach, both for the university and outside of the university. And a content note before we dive into it, I am going to be talking about genitals and sex and pregnancy, and I will mention bioessentialist theories, but that's not my view. And I will be talking about surgery, and I am going to be talking about how doctors and medical professionals and biologists aren't always the best at dealing with trans and intersex patients. Yeah. And I think this is an important thing to note, that even though I don't claim that sex and gender are equivalent, that they are that there's a one-to-one correlation or anything, it's very difficult to talk about gender without also talking about sex, because a lot of our descriptors of gender are in relation to sex, i.e. someone is cisgender or transgender as in relation to the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you call someone cis or refer to yourself as trans or whatever, in that case you are actually talking about yourself in relation to your physiological sex. Also, biomedical, neurological and psychological researchers tend to approach gender development as an extension of sex development. That being said, we in the scientific community don't actually have a proper working definition of gender. We don't have any good explanations of what it is or where it comes from. And a lot of the research into that is highly flawed, to put it mildly. Yeah, and also if, and I know that the acronym LGBTQI, whether you include the A or not, is controversial because it's, by its very nature, it's either exclusionary because you've got a limited number of letters, or it becomes unwieldy long. If we're going to include the I in there, then we have to consider that the intersex part of that is considered part of the gender and sexuality, umbrella, I suppose. So, yeah, sex is ill-defined in biology and medicine. There is not actually a consistent definition of what male and female actually mean. Depending on what field in biology you're in, you're going to have different definitions. If you're a geneticist, you might talk about chromosomes. If you're an embryologist, you might talk about genital formation. If you're an ecologist or an animal behavioralist, you'll be looking more at essentially gender roles, including gender roles of, or perceived gender roles of animals. And yeah, unless specifically under investigation, scientists don't tend to look that much at gender, just because we're a little bit scared of it, because we don't know what it is. And there's this assumption that we know what we're talking about when we say male or female, but really these categories are not as well defined as a lot of scientists and doctors like to pretend they are. So the male and female model of sex is just that, it's a model. It's intended to explain a concept by sort of paring it down to its most simplest ideas. And the value of a model is if it can explain and predict phenomena. So the binary sex model is great for explaining that if someone with a penis ejaculates inside someone with a vagina, they are likely to get pregnant. It's great at explaining that. But it doesn't actually account for all cases. It doesn't account for cases where either party is infertile. It doesn't account for instances where people are having sex with people that they would not be able to produce offspring with. So it's a model, and it's great for explaining reproduction, but that's as far as it goes. Like another example of a model in science is perhaps the Rutherford-Bohr model of the atom. If you took chemistry at in year 12, I think, you will have learnt about how the atom, you've got your nucleus and your electrons around it, and how a lot of depictions you see, it looks kind of like a solar system. No, that's not at all what an atom is actually like. But it's a useful model for understanding the principle. So, as I've said, sex, the concept, not the act, exists to describe reproductive function. And there's sort of 4 or 5 categories that we talk about when we talk about sex. So we're talking about someone's genetics, So what chromosomes they have that they've inherited from their biological parents, and what sort of genetic imprinting they have that's to do with epigenetics. Then there's the gonads and the gametes. So gonads are testes and ovaries, or in rare cases ovotestis, which is when there is both ovarian and testicular tissue in the same individual, sometimes within the same organ. And then produced by the testes is sperm, and by the ovaries is eggs, or oocytes. And then above that there's the genitals and accessory organs, so that's things like penis, scrotum, prostate, or vulva, uterus, fallopian tubes, those sorts of structures. And then above that there's the secondary sexual characteristics, which is largely controlled by hormone production, which is things like body and facial hair, broad shoulders or broad hips, voice pitch, that sort of thing. So chromosomal sex is usually determined by sperm. I say usually because with just about every example of anything in biology, there's always edge cases where things don't quite follow the usual route. So typically the person producing sperm is going to have a Y chromosome. Well, actually, if you're producing sperm, you have a Y chromosome, because sperm production is coded for by the Y chromosome. And so that is passed down from the sperm donor. The egg donor will never be able to, well, it's highly unlikely that the egg donor will be providing the Y chromosome for their genetic offspring. Now, typically you have either an XX or XY configuration of your chromosomes. However, there are other variations that you get. There's X0, which is like you've only got one X chromosome and no pair to it. There's mosaic chromosomes, where you might have some cells that have XX and some that have XY, or XXX, XX, XXX, XY. It gets very complicated very quickly. So, as I said before, the Y chromosome is where your sperm generation actually comes from, because the Y chromosome codes for testis production. So on the Y chromosome, which is this, so in the background you can see the X chromosome and then the much smaller Y chromosome, and on there is a small region called the SRY, the sex determining region of the Y chromosome. Biology is full of these three-letter acronyms. That's why it's 3 letters, not SDRYC. It's just convention. So on there are the genes responsible for producing the Leydig and Sertoli cells that are the ones that actually produce sperm. So this eventually leads to testes production, which leads to sperm production, and will also lead to androgen production, which are hormones, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And if you don't have these genes, or you have these genes and they don't function as they typically would, then the embryo, or you, the embryo, whoever we're talking about here, will likely produce ovaries. And then genital and accessory organs are the result of hormone levels. So androgens, as I've said, are produced by the testes. So this is things like testosterone and anti-Müllerian hormone, but most notably testosterone. So that causes the genital ridge on the developing embryo to become a penis or penis-like structure. And if you don't have these androgens, or your body doesn't receive these androgen signals, even if the androgens are still there, then the genital ridge is going to go down what is essentially the default pathway to a vulva or vulva-like structure. And additionally, these hormones will create the secondary sex characteristics, which were those things like the hips, the shoulders, the lower voice, the breasts, the hair development, that kind of thing. All the things you associate with puberty, really. And so estrogens so that's estradiol and progesterone, they'll produce breasts, broader hips, they'll change fat deposition and increase sexual behavior. And androgens will result in voice deepening, facial and body hair, broader shoulders, increase in sexual behavior, and it seems aggressive tendencies. Now, there's a great deal of variation in these sex characteristics, especially these secondary sexual characteristics. As I'm sure you're aware, there's lots of variation in whether people grow facial hair, how much leg hair they have, how big or small breasts may be, etc. So on here I've got a sort of graph showing people's estradiol levels over their testosterone levels. Sorry, other way around. Estradiol levels over their testosterone levels over their estradiol levels. And you can see that there's sort of two major camps, which is the typical male that has high levels of testosterone and lower levels of estrogen or estradiol, and the other camp which has higher levels of estradiol and lower levels of testosterone. However, you can see that there's plenty of people that have little of either, or somewhere in between, or high levels of both, and so you can see that there is plenty of variation in the amount of hormones that people may have. This was a very difficult graph to produce. I had to make this myself. Now that I've sort of explained what sex is, it can be medically altered, and these can be like fairly superficial things like surface level stuff. It could be metabolic and hormonal, so you can give hormones that will simulate the sex hormones, or ones that will inhibit other ones. Then there's more structural ones, which are like surgical procedures. And then there's gonadal, which is, again, surgical, but that's at the gametic level. So what gametes a person is or then isn't producing, and what hormones their body will produce. Chromosomal sex can't be altered, and it really shouldn't. There's a lot of genes on your chromosomes, and you don't really want to be getting rid of a whole bunch of genes all at once, or adding a whole bunch of genes. It's not good for you. And in addition to that, there's all sorts of ethical concerns around, like, you know, then are you even your parents' children, that kind of thing. So don't do that. So I'm going to argue that shaving, waxing, and hair removal is a sex-altering procedure. So the removal of hair from the face and from the body is changing one's secondary sexual characteristics, because these secondary sexual characteristics have reproductive function. The idea of a beard is it demonstrates that there is high levels of testosterone and that this person is particularly virile. And then the idea of soft, supple skin is meant to give the idea of fertility in a feminine sense. So by changing the amount of hair on someone's body, you change the sexual physiology, at least from an external perspective. And the thing is, this is what we mostly judge people's sex on, is their secondary sexual characteristics. We don't tend to meet someone and immediately try and identify what's around their crotch area. Well, at least I don't. So that was the sort of superficial thing. Then we've got hormone replacement therapy. This is that metabolic hormonal changes. So you can have hormone blockers, so gonadotrophin releasing hormone agonists, anti-androgens. You might hear these referred to as T blockers, as in they block T for testosterone. Aromatase inhibitors, which prevent the conversion of one of the corticosteroid hormones into estradiol and progesterone. And then if you're receiving hormone blockers, you're also likely to be receiving hormone supplements to make up for the lack of steroid hormones in your body. So you'd be then given estrogen or testosterone. Now, these are given to people who are undergoing medical transition and people who are going through menopause and people who have intersex conditions and people who have things that some people would not describe as intersex conditions, some people would, such as polycystic ovarian syndrome. Then there's more intense things again. This is structural. So this is reassignment surgeries, and they tend to be given these abbreviations, MTF and FTM, so male to female, female to male. I don't necessarily agree with these descriptions, but these are the most common ones that you're going to find. So male to female reassignment surgeries, or sexual reassignment surgeries, you see them abbreviated as SRS. That's things like breast augmentation, which is described as a mammoplasty, and a vaginoplasty, which is typically done by penile inversion, in which because the structure of the penis and the vagina, vulva, etc. are actually analogous in some sense. So they take the analogous structures and form them into the vaginal vulval equivalents. So the glands of the penis becomes the clitoris, the skin on the shaft of the penis becomes the labia minoris, and the scrotum becomes the labia majoris. Then there's FTM, which is sort of the other approach, which is mastectomy, so that's removal of the breasts, metoidioplasty, which is the enlargement of a fallow clitoris. When someone with a clitoris takes testosterone and androgen supplements, the clitoris will grow in length, and a metoidioplasty is intended to shape this increased length clitorophallus, or phalloclitoris, however you want to describe it, into a more penile shape. And then there's a phalloplasty, which is a very intense procedure and has a high failure rate, which is when they actually build an entire phallus. So they take the clitoris, extend that out to be the glands of the penis, and then they build a structure, and they put a skin graft, typically taken from someone's arm or thigh. To build that, they have to extend a urethra, which is a very difficult thing and often fails. People get urethral fistulas, which is basically, if here's your urethra, here's the end of the new phallus, this bit of the urethra fuses with the side of the penis or the new phallus, and you will then start urinating halfway along the shaft. This is not good and is prone to a lot of infections, but people still receive these surgeries because it's necessary for some people to truly feel themselves. And this is why it's very important to not disregard sex when we're talking about gender, because for a lot of people, their sense of gender is tied up very closely with their physical embodiment, and if they can't embody their own sex, embody their own gender, they will alter their sex in potentially dangerous ways. And then moving on from that, we have so this is the gonadal level, so gonadectomy and sterilization surgery. So this is, ectomy means to remove, so gonadectomy, to remove the gonads. So there's things like vasectomy, which you've probably heard of. It's actually more technically called vasoligation, and that is when they close up the vas deferens, meaning that you don't get sperm and semen leaving the seminal vesicle out the penis. And then there's tubal ligation, which is the fallopian tube equivalent, which is tying up, closing up, or cauterizing one's fallopian tubes so that eggs cannot pass from the ovaries into the uterus. Then there's a hysterectomy, which is a partial or complete removal of uterus. And then you've got orchiectomy, which is the removal of testes. This is often performed in conjunction with a vaginoplasty, although not always. Sometimes it's just a castration. And then there's oophorectomy, which is a great word, oophorectomy, or ovurotomy, which is the partial or complete removal of one's ovaries. And so all of these make someone sterile, so they may still have external organs that would imply sexual reproductive ability, but they don't actually have that ability because of their internal lack of gamete production. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different applications of these procedures. So we've got two main classes, and this is my distinction. And the two main distinctions between these classes, gender affirming and normalization, is the intent and the consent. So affirming treatments are usually for people who are experiencing gender dysphoria and or a negative body image. And I say that because gender affirming therapies are not necessarily for trans and intersex patients. Because as I mentioned, to shave one's legs is an alteration of one's sex. Right? Now, breast implants. A lot of cis women get breast implants. This is not exclusive to trans women or other people who want to embody a feminine body. But these are gender affirming therapies. And then there's normalization surgeries, which is generally performed on people with ambiguous sex. So that's people who get classed as intersex and people who don't necessarily get classed as intersex but still get lumped into the category of being ambiguous. And what I mean by that is some people will claim that polycystic ovarian syndrome is an intersex condition. Some people won't. However, people who have PCOS will often receive hair removal things, hair removal treatments. They might even receive hormone replacement therapy to make them present more female. So we're going to talk about the differences between intent and consent. So gender affirming therapy and normalization, intent. So affirming surgeries are intended as a treatment for dysphoria. Because gender dysphoria is listed in the DSM-5, I think, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the Diagnosis of Mental Disorders. And the treatment for gender dysphoria is not like conversion therapy or anything. It's gender-affirming therapies. So that's hormone replacement, surgery, etc. Now, normalization surgeries are intended as a prevention for dysphoria. So that is, they're intended to try and prevent the dysphoria from ever occurring in the first place. Whether this works is, well, it's been established that this doesn't actually work all that well. But it still kind of happens. There's a pretty awful case of a person who was given a normalization surgery. In fact, they weren't intersex at birth. They had a botched circumcision, and they lost the tip of their penis. And so the surgeons were like, what do we do? What do we do? And so they constructed a vagina for this person. And then the parents were told, well, now the person has a vagina, you should raise them as a female, you should raise them as a girl. And it was reported that raising this person as a girl was very successful. The person was very happy in their gender identity as female, and then they began transitioning. They began medical transition to a male embodiment in their teenage years, and then came into a lot of trouble. This case got publicized. There was a lot of controversy surrounding them, and they eventually took their own life. But that particular case study and the success that they reported about is actually led to normalization surgeries becoming commonplace. And, well, it wasn't a success, but they thought it was a success, and so they just rolled out this procedure for everyone else. Yeah?
Can I just add something there? So some of you know about this case, won't you? You know it's John Money and the case of the Canadian Does everyone know that? Oh, okay. So John Money actually got his undergraduate psychology degree here at 20 years ago. And then went on to Johns Hopkins, and he became very famous, and he came up with this theory about gender assignment, and the case is a case of two Canadian twins, I believe. And it is a very sad case, but you can find out about it on the internet. And what happened in the end was the person who had the reassignment surgery ended up committing suicide, and then the twin, very sadly, committed suicide as well. And Money was very naughty because he was trying to convince the academic world that this was actually successful. But in actual fact, according to other scholars who were observing the case, it wasn't. So thank you, Helen.
Yeah. And to add on to that, Money did actually start changing his tune a bit later in life, but by that point the damage was already done. And so, yeah, we did a lot of normalization surgeries during the second half of the 20th century. Now, that being said, normalization surgery, well, not normalization surgery, but urogenital surgery, may still be required in cases where someone is born with ambiguous genitalia, because there may be obstruction of the urethra. So a person may be born with fused labia but not an extended urethra, and in those cases the hole is covered and the people can't urinate. So sometimes a surgery is necessary, but that doesn't require it to be a normalization surgery. Just to open up enough space to allow someone to urinate is not the same as completely reconstructing a vagina. So then the other thing, so that was intent. Now consent is the other thing. Affirming procedures are always initiated by the patient. Now, it's very rarely that someone will go to a hair removal specialist because they've been forced to by a doctor, or their parents are like, no, my child has got too much of a beard, I'm going to send them to there. But normalization surgeries are usually initiated by a pediatrician, that is a child's doctor, and are done with the parent's consent. Now, normalization surgeries can also, or procedures can also occur later in life, but they're usually initiated by the doctor. So the doctor sees a patient come in and they don't appear typically male or typically female, and they think, something's wrong here, and they try and fix that. They try and normalize this person. Don't do that. Yeah, basic takeaway message from this is gender affirming good, normalization bad. Yeah, and I thought just at the end of this, because I have talked about like deconstructing sex and all that, do we abandon the binary sex model? No, it is still very useful for explaining reproduction. You need to explain to kids where babies come from at some point. But don't use it as the exclusive, we shouldn't use it as the exclusive model for sex, because it doesn't work. I actually work in healthcare when I'm not voluntarily doing lectures. And this sort of binary model has actually caused a few problems. I work as a phlebotomist, that is someone who takes blood samples, and occasionally we'll get calls up from the lab being like, does this woman really need a prostate-specific antigen test? And we'll be like, well, they've gone home now, so I can't exactly ask them if they have a prostate. But because their profile, their details on the computer system is basically like you have an M or you have an F, it doesn't actually account for people who don't have what is typically considered male or female. So a trans woman who's undergone hormone replacement therapy is at risk of breast cancer, but is also at risk of prostate cancer. Now, if you assign this person a male or female label within a medical document, within a medical system, they're going to get the letter in the mail saying, hey, you're due for your mammogram, but they're not going to get the reminders for prostate checks, which are equally important. Or if they remain as male, one, that is not very pleasant for the patient, but two, it means that they're not going to get the reminders for mammograms. So there's a lot of health risks associated with having a very unnuanced model. And it'll actually benefit all patients having a more nuanced model, because the thing is, every time we have to do a test for someone's estradiol and progesterone levels, it asks what day of their cycle they're on, but like 70% of people don't menstruate because they are premenstrual, postmenopausal, or never had a uterus to begin with. And so, but we still have to fill out the checkbox. So it's a benefit to all patients and doctors and things to actually have a more nuanced model of sex, and hopefully there can be more crosstalk between you guys, gender studies, and the medical field, so that we can actually get these more nuanced models of sex incorporated into medical teaching. All right. Any questions? Yes.
I had a comment about like the whole communication and how can we get it recognizing gender and sex diversity.
Mhm.
And like, I know, for example, at my university in health where there's a lot of change going on in how people can identify when they're first filling out those health forms. So
Mhm.
instead of having like, because often it's really confusing as well if they just have like gender, male or female, so it's like come across that. And then you can say, well, if you're aware that gender and sex are different things, you're like, do I have to legally put what my sex and my birth certificate is, or do I put myself like gender because that's into gender? So one way that maybe that could be like improved on is having like sex assigned at birth is important to
Mhm.
like realize like the doctors to know.
Yeah.
But then also your self-identify gender,
Mhm.
and not just having male or female, but having a blank box where you can put however you identify with. And then also having like good finances, like just both like interaction and service, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, but I think it could be even more nuanced than that and actually have a series of check boxes like, does this person menstruate? What is their genital configuration? You know, what are their hormone levels like? Have they ever had a sexual karyotype? If so, what chromosomes do they have?
For the person, but
For the, well, initially when the person is born,
right.
and then later in life, you know, not just like actually have like a, does this person menstruate? Because often people don't. It's fairly common, and that can be a sign that you're malnourished, or it could be a sign that you just don't. Yeah. Any other questions, points, anything? Any questions about the readings or the reading that I gave you? Has anyone done the reading?
I just have a question because I think this is really interesting, but also how we can start implementing this learning at a younger level, like
Mm-hmm.
beginning sex and gender education. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on taking quite a nuanced approach and kind of how we can start putting that into like younger forms of education.
Kids can understand anything if you explain it well.
Yeah.
Like I taught a 6-year-old about orbital physics. Like, you can teach kids anything. You just need to explain it well and make sure that they're not missing part of the information beforehand. So, yeah, you could introduce a more nuanced take on sexual development in your standard puberty classes that you get at intermediate school. Yeah?
How would you go about, I'm not this is the wrong word, but how would you go about talking to adults about this? Because I've been in so many discussions about stuff like this where it doesn't matter what you lay out for them, how much stuff you lay out for them, they just don't want to listen. So how would you go about, say, explaining some of these concepts in such a way that they would at least acknowledge that some of these things are at least possible? Not by getting them to actually accept the idea, because that won't happen in some instances, but just getting them to acknowledge that these things are there.
I mean, as many facts as you can actually cite. If you can actually be like, look, here's this paper, here's this study, here's this survey done by the Intersex Association America. You know, if you can provide those and be like, look, there's actually evidence behind my claims, then often that's more successful. If that doesn't work, wait 10 years, then you're the grown-ups. Yeah. Anything else? No?
People have such, or some people have such vested interests though in believing that the binary model is true Or some people do. I mean, probably very few people in this room, I mean, anybody, but I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, I think it's because the binary model is not actually described as a model. Because again, going back to that example of the Year 12 chemistry learning about the Rutherford-Bohr model of the atom, that's explained often as a model. You say, look, this is one way of looking at an atom, one way of describing an atom. With sex, they don't really do that. Instead, they say, this is what sex is. I wrote an article for Salient a couple of weeks back titled The Elusive History of Intersex that actually talks about how we went from a more nuanced understanding of sexual development to this very rigid binary model and then we've had that for about 100 years, but we didn't have such a rigid understanding of it before then. And it's all thanks to Edwin Albrecht Klebs, who created this binary structure that we've been relying on for 100 years. So if you can find that. Oh, yeah, question?
So with the idea that you want to, like, for medical forms, having your active gender and having your identified gender and then having things like the condom and the research and things like that. I think it's a really idea and it does appreciate in terms of that there are a lot of people might not understand, I guess, how to fill out the form, which I guess can be a problem if you just ask someone, but I mean, I don't know, I am female, was being female, I identify as female, and I went to an all-girl Catholic school and had no sex ed, so I feel bothered, so I give people quite a bit. But until you explained all this to me just now, if you were asking me to fill out a form like this before we've done this, I would have like freaking through and fill it out. So I feel like it's a good idea, but I feel like it might be a bit more complicated than people.
Yeah, the thing is a lot of these tick boxes can be filled out by the doctors themselves. Because when a baby is delivered, they can go, okay, this is what I see. Do a little heel prick test. Okay, can send that off to the lab. They can then run a chromosome check. They can do a karyotype and then, a couple of hours later come back with okay, so it looks like they are XY, cool. And then you've already got part of that done. And then, later on when the person hits around 15, 16, you might then be like, if they've been listed as having a vaginal structure, then you say, okay, have you had your period yet? Tick that box. Additionally, the forms could also have a don't know checkbox. It's always an option. Yeah. Anything else? As if not, I need to rush somewhere else and do another presentation on the treatment of shingles.